To keep the grin off my face all day. What a fantastic day for LGB people. I'm astounded that we've managed to gather 450 right-wing Christian American evangelicals in the one room. Now, you're also supposed to be rich. So I just want to say, where's the money? We've had no money, and I was wondering if it's because you don't have our correct bank account number. So it's 666 666. And on money, we do have the facility for you to donate to us today if you would care to. It's out in the exhibition centre. But a huge thank you to everyone who's donated, everyone who's supporting us by their presence here today, and every single one of you heroes who has stood up and said, I am proud to be LGB. Thank you very, very much. I don't know if any of you know, but I used to be a prison governor, so no, don't fall asleep, don't try and sneak out, and do not interrupt me, okay. So I need to tell you some stuff. If there's a fire alarm, our procedure is to get out of the building by any exit close to you, but then to go to the front. We have arranged with Methodist Central Hall, which is out the front across to the right, that we can reassemble there. In the unlikely event we can't get back in here, we will simply carry our conference on over the road. There will be a cordon of security staff to get you across to that building in the event there are any dafties shouting at you. Please do not engage with the dafties. Don't speak to them, don't shout back, just ignore them. They said they would be here all day, but that probably means from about 3 o'clock onwards because they're all about 17. God love them. It's probably best if you stay in for lunch, because if not, you have to go through all that security palaver again. Lunch is free, in case you hadn't picked that up, and it will be in a dinky wee box. And if you have any complaints about it, we don't care, because we're not going to ask for feedback. When the conference finishes at 6 o'clock, that seems a long time away, we're going to go straight into the final session, and you're going to love the big gay disco. Especially those of you that were around in the 70s and 80s, Bev Jackson. But there'll be some more modern music as well, which was picked by popular choice on our Twitter account. Now, speaking of Twitter, there are 2 hashtags for the conference. We are hashtag LGB Alliance 2021, and we are hashtag free2, it's dead hip, free2be LGB, if you'd like to tweet, and we'd love you too. You'll have seen already all of our volunteers have yellow badges, so please do speak to them if you've got any complaints. There are screens outside that you'll see when you go out for your breaks showing messages from our supporters around the world. Contrary to popular belief, we are not part of big global conspiracy. We don't actually control all of these 17 countries, but they are independent LGB groups who have aligned with us, if you like. Please visit the stalls, and in particular the topic-specific conversation stations that are out there, so that you can speak to like-minded people, perhaps people who have an interest or work in your area. And please do feel free to speak to any of the management team or trustees, and you'll meet most of us throughout the day. We also have book signings across the day at the book stand, and there are lots of relevant, there's some irrelevant books available, lots of relevant books there for you. I think it was appropriate that we picked heroes for our opening music, and I've already said that you are, and I'll see if I can do this without crying, but there are 2 women who have been the agitators behind all of this. The agitators, the organisers, the mobilisers, the vision, the commitment, the passion. And they are the heart and soul of LGB Alliance, and it is my great pleasure to introduce Bev Jackson and Kate Harris.
Well, thank you. Hello, everybody. We are not here to speechify because we have the most amazing group of speakers here for you today. And all I want to say to you now is thank you. Thank you to all our supporters for staying with us throughout. You've really helped us to get here through some of them very difficult moments sometimes over the past 2 years. Thank you to everyone here and also to all our supporters around the world, because we know that they're with us in spirit. Thank you.
Hello, everybody. I walked out of Westminster Tube Station early this morning, and I looked straight in front of me, and I looked up at the birthing parent of all parliaments. And it struck me that the vast majority of our representatives and peers who work in the gender parent of all parliaments are well-intentioned, but in the last few years, they have been led a merry dance. They have lost the plot, they have gone off-piste, and they, sadly, have become responsible for the misery that is affecting a generation of children. And unless we stop it, it will continue. So, our goal today is to feel the love. This has been the hardest 2 years of our lives, and we wouldn't have got through it without the love and support from all of you and individuals all around the world. And I thank you from the bottom of my heart. Our second goal is to ensure that for once, Parliament listens to us. We are the future for evidence-based policy making as it affects LGBT people and as it affects children. Today is going to be wonderful, fantastic. I love you all, and thank you for coming.
Thank you very much. Thank you. My partner and I keep chickens, and Kate and Bev know what's coming. And we decided we would get some rescue chickens. And when you get rescue chickens, they look a wee bit scraggy because they're a little bit past their best, but they do buff up quite well. So we were pondering names for them, and we thought, Bev and Kate! Anyway, I'm delighted to introduce the first of our panel sessions. It's on lies, gender identity and stereotypes, how our institutions are erasing LGB. And to introduce and chair the session, we have our talking gay man for the morning, our trustee, Malcolm Clark.
Wow, wow. I'm looking at a sea of faces. If you'd said 2 years ago, or 18 months ago when we were in Glasgow at the Oran Moor, if anybody remembers that. if you'd said in 18 months we'd be at an event opposite Westminster Abbey, beside Parliament, looking out at 400 people, or 500 maybe, by the time I get on Twitter it'll be 600, I would have told you were mad. But so it's fantastic. It is such an honor to chair this panel, the first at our very first annual conference, hopefully one of many, especially with such a distinguished panel. We have, starting from the right, Helen Joyce. She was quite prominent at The Economist, but now she's a best-selling author. Books can be signed later on. We have Sinead Watson, who is Often people talk about detransitioners and people who transition as if they're all vulnerable and you know, all sort of like under pressure. Sinead is one of the smartest people I've ever met, and and proves, I think, that actually one of the problems with the pressure on young people is it captures really clever, smart girls in particular who don't like the gendered world out there, want to oppose it, and that's what gets, that's one of the reasons they get caught up. So we'll hear from Sinead later on, but it's always a very moving story. Kate Grimes, ex-CEO of a hospital trust. As we know, the NHS is the biggest employer in the country, and we're going to hear more about how a certain idea has captured the biggest employer in the country. This is I knew this was going to happen. You were only put on the panel yesterday. You can introduce yourself.
Hi, I'm Tanya Carter. I'm one of the spokeswomen for Safe Schools Alliance. And thank you very much for having me here, and thank you for that welcome.
We've never met before, that's why. And then Az Hakeem, who is one of the most distinguished experts in the area of gender dysphoria. I would just say one tiny little thing. I'm going to ask everybody before we start with the main contributions to tell us how they got to where they are today. And I don't mean in terms of their eminence in their career, but the fact that they're facing 500 LGBT people in a conference room. For me, you know, 40 years ago, I was a young gay man in Glasgow, and I went to the student union and said, hello, I'm president of the Gay Society, and I would like to book a room for the Gay Society. And they said, fuck off, you poof. And that was the beginning of my sort of forced career, if you like, in gay rights. We eventually, you know, we picketed, we got the student union was banned from NUS, and we eventually were allowed to hold meetings. We were allowed to hold meetings in a student union. That's where we were. Homophobia everywhere. And now we're today where we actually were, Pink News, the leading gay newspaper, was trying to get our meeting banned. So we've come full circle. We couldn't have meetings in a student union, and now we're not allowed, says the gay newspaper, to have a meeting today. The subject of our discussion today, I once made a show about ideas and how they capture institutions and minds. This is a session about one idea, a strange one that somehow crept through British society. It's called gender identity. Where did it come from? How did it sneak into people's minds? How did it change people's bodies? How did it lead to a world of lies and deception? That's what our subject's going to be, and this distinguished panel is going to help us explore that. But first of all, I'd like to ask you each, how did you get to today? What was your, very briefly, what was your personal journey? I'll start with Helen.
Well, I was asked to write an article about it, that's how, and I knew nothing about it. I started to ask questions. I got responses unlike any responses I had ever received to questions I had asked as a journalist before. Told that for asking very straightforward questions about what people meant, what was happening, that I was a bigot, a Nazi, I wanted people to die, I wanted them up against the wall, I deserved to die myself, etc., etc. And like any good journalist, but it turns out that lots of journalists aren't very good, when someone doesn't want you to find out something, that's when you keep asking. So that's why I'm here 3 years later, and that's why I've written a book, with one additional sort of stopping point along the way, which was meeting detransitioners for the first time. Because theoretically I understood that in the name of this idea that Malcolm has described, children were being misled into doing things to their bodies. And when I met some young people who had been through that journey, some of whom are really in so much more difficult a situation. I don't mean to downplay Sinead's story at all, but Sinead's sitting here, she's able to speak, and some people aren't able to speak. that was when I decided I had to write the book, because they're sterilising gay children in the name of an idea. And if you hear that and your response is anything other than, holy shit, I better find out more, then you are morally bankrupt.
Hello. Well, I ended up here because I actually, as has been said, went through medical transition, so I know all too well exactly how you can end up in a situation where you convince yourself that you're born in the wrong body, and the people who are supposed to be there to help you just go along with it. And when I did detransition, I wasn't helped by counsellors or therapists or anything like that. They didn't want to hear it. So I thought, I'll go online and I'll find a few other detransitioners and just find out what's going to happen. And I could not believe how many other detransitioners I found and the abuse that they got. So when I started talking about transition, detransition, transition regret online, and I got death threats, I got rape threats, and I know that a lot of other detransitioners do as well. So I thought, okay, I can either stop talking about it and just sort of play it safe and go quiet, or I can refuse to shut up and try and shed a light on this, which is why I'm here.
I retired in 2016, and I didn't really know very much about it before I retired. And then I started to learn more on the internet, and I got more and more shocked by it. And eventually I felt that I understood enough to write something. So I wrote an article for the Health Service Journal, which is a journal which all NHS managers look at. And I wrote suggesting that being part of Stonewall was no longer compatible with NHS values. Yep. And I got an awful lot of abuse for it. I mean, I wasn't surprised. I was expecting a lot of abuse, but nonetheless, it still shocked me, the amount of abuse I got. And then a few days later, a trans woman wrote a rebuttal, which again got a lot of support. And all that's really done is fired me up to do more.
Tanya.
Hello. Basically, my background is I'm a mum. I've had children in tow my whole adult life, and through that I've worked early years. I've been a chair of governors at my children's school. I've been a rainbow leader. I've done all that. So I've had 20 years safeguarding training. And so every time I've seen something that's a concern, I've stood up and said something. For a long time, it's concerned me what children were reading online and misinformation and how slow adults were to really know what children were looking at online. And then around sort of 2014, 2015, my children were all at secondary school at this point, and they started talking about children who are transitioning. And I've always really believed in inclusion. I was always one that fought to have Stonewall in school. I wanted children spoken to about how using gay to sort of mean naff was really not nice, especially when some of your classmates may not have come out and they're listening to that. And then my daughter came out as lesbian, and when she was in year 10, her and her girlfriend were asked at school when they were older which one of them would transition so that they could father a child. And she came home and told me this, and I was like, well, that's just not going to happen. So I talked it through with my daughter, and I got through to her that you can't literally change sex and you won't be fathering a baby as a trans man. But she went into school and tried to explain this to the girl who told her this, who she'd read online, and she couldn't get through to her. So I reported it to school safeguarding, as was just my hobby, reporting things to, to school safeguarding, sort of like, what are they reading online now? What are we doing about this? And they were just totally out of their depth, school safeguarding. And after that, I started writing to anyone I thought might listen to me, and somehow I sort of ended up here, basically, because I won't shut up and go away.
first of all, thank you for having me. So I'm Az, and how did I get here? So as a small child in North Wales, I couldn't decide whether I wanted to do medicine or fine art. I really wanted to do fine art. So I couldn't decide. So I applied to both, and I got into both. And I decided the day before what I was going to do. I actually forgot to tell the Fine Art College I wasn't going. And then when I did medicine, I thought the idea of changing someone into the opposite sex was this wonderful piece of sculpture. And then I was torn between plastic surgery or psychiatry, because I always wanted to do psychiatry. And my first house job was at UCL in plastics, and I used to help do the gender reassignment surgeries. I mean, I was a houseman. I was only holding retractors. I wasn't doing anything amazing. And I went from thinking this is fantastic, wonderful sculpture to thinking, I wonder what's happening in their heads. Why are we doing this? Because it's not just a sculpture, it's a person. What's happening in their mind? And the surgeons weren't really bothered about what was happening in their minds because they were master craftsmen. They had delegated that to the psychiatrist. So I thought, okay, fine, I'll find out more when I do psychiatry. So I trained in psychiatry and found out that nobody was thinking there either. I thought, this is strange. So I then decided to specialise in the smallest medical specialty possible, called forensic psychotherapy. There was three trainees in the country. And I went to the Pullman Clinic. And it was quite nice at the Pullman Clinic because they said you've got 5 years and you can sort of do what you want. So I set up in 2000, that's when I started there, I set up a gender dysphoria psychotherapy service. I inherited a therapy group for post-operative transsexuals, all of who were in a state of regret. I inherited a pre-operative group, which were all full of idealized gender euphoria. And I combined them into a combined group. I then ran multiple groups. I saw people individually. I did an assessment service, and I ran that up until I left the NHS in 2012, and I now do it privately. And 20 years ago, I actually thought I was the only gender-critical person on the planet. That's what it felt like. And I felt like the little boy in the Emperor's New Clothes. In fact, that was my first paper. It didn't go down well because the Tavistock switchboard was shut down with complaints because I wasn't very diplomatic then. I've toned it down since. So that's how I came here. So I've got the unusual accolade of being the only consultant psychiatrist in medical psychotherapy that specialises in psychotherapy for gender dysphoria, which either means it's really boring and no one else wants to do it, or that's probably all it means, really.
Thank you. Okay, we've had the starters. Now we get to the meat course. Well, I shouldn't say that. There'll be loads of vegans in here. The main course. The main course. Helen, would you like to lead off?
How long do you want me to talk for?
7 or 8 minutes. Now, Rona, wherever Rona, I think you're going to do the signals, aren't you? If you see an ex-prison governor come there and go like this, then get to your punchline.
So what's been occupying my mind for the past few weeks is the role of courage, and specifically how more of us can do things that help to shift the situation. And obviously Kathleen Stock is the reason that I've been thinking about this so hard. And it's very upsetting looking at what Kathleen is going through for those many of us who've had similar experiences going back quite a long time as well. This isn't a recent phenomenon. You know, there have been people who've had this sort of thing happen to them when nobody was paying any attention. But looking at Kathleen, I had a realization, which was that what's happening to her is that she's been put in the pillory. And that's that sort of, you know, medieval, basically torture device where you're tied to something and you're put on a platform and people can pelt you or shout abuse at you or indeed assault you because your hands and head are immobilized. And the purpose of it isn't so much to hurt you as to shame you. It puts you outside normal rules of civil society, and it turns you permanently in your culture, in your group, into somebody about whom anything can be said, and without any recourse. So you permanently lose your status. It's extraordinary to watch Kathleen being libelled, but of course many people here have experienced that too, including me. And I thought to myself, many of us say, Julie Bindel says it very effectively and very often, that if more people spoke out, it wouldn't be left to the few people who speak out to do it on their own. And I think she's right, but I think she's only part right, because if you imagine that person in the pillory, there's not much that another villager could do for them. Like, someone very brave might go and stand with them, and that might improve the situation a bit, because they'd be less scared. But actually what you've now got is you've got two people who've put themselves outside the rules of civilized society and have permanently marked themselves as people who can be libelled and insulted with impunity. What's needed is to stop the pillory. And that didn't stop because people rose up en masse. It stopped because people in power wanted to stop it. And nobody ended up in the pillory who had someone powerful on their side. So if you had somebody who had status and social cachet, this sort of punishment did not happen to you. And that was when it twigged for me that this is about institutions and employers, most importantly employers. Because I look at Kathleen and I think, there, but for the grace of God, go I. I think it's universally accepted that I'm even more of an awful bigot than she is. And yet I'm sitting here and I'm okay, and she is not able to go to her workplace, has been told that she needs bodyguards, that she has to have a pinhole in her door to see who's there, and is suffering really mightily, and has been turned into a public spectacle, which must be deeply unpleasant for such a private person. So the difference is my employer, and my employer didn't agree with me when I started talking about this, but had two basic intellectual commitments. And the first of those was one to free speech, and the second was an absolute hatred of bullies. And that's all it took, because when people came and said, noted bigot Helen Joyce is writing for you, you'd better fire her, they said, thank you very much for your opinion, now shove off. And they shoved off. It was extraordinary. And then they've come back a few times, but there's not been much. And so what we need to do is to work out how, in particular, employers can grow a spine, because that's what every totalitarian does. They start with trying to make people not able to make a living. That sounds like an exaggeration. It is not an exaggeration. It's the literal truth. If you look at totalitarian regimes, even the ones that went on to genocide, they start with trying to ruin people's lives via their employers. So we need to think, we've done the reach out to people, we've done the talking to people, we now know that we aren't the only gender critical person in the world, each of us. We need to think how we can start to effectively change what employers and other institutions do. And I think that does involve some networking and finding a group of people, whether that's a group of co-employees or whether it might be a group of parents at an individual school. And then we need to think smart about how to influence that institution. So with schools, we've got the Safe Schools Alliance, we've got Transgender Trend. They have very, very good information about what the law is on things like single-sex spaces, what the safeguarding rules are. And we can start to take schools individually away from this really awful path they've gone along. With employers, workplace regulations do say you have to have single-sex spaces. These are not bigoted things to say. We've had Maya Forstatter's case. We now know that you can't be fired or otherwise victimised for saying that male and female are real things. And we need to start working together to stop the employers threatening people's livelihoods and help them to grow a spine. And then all of this comes back, I think, above all, to the question of what's happening to children, which I know is the topic of this panel. I had this experience last night that just crystallized another thing for me about how people aren't listening to what we say. I did a think-in for Tortoise Media, which was fun, and I said why I'd written the book. It was about cowardice and bravery in publishing, and I explained how hard it had been to get the book published. And in the course of that, I said the reason that I actually decided to stop wondering if I was the right person to write this book, what would happen, would I lose my job, whatever, was when I discovered they were sterilizing children. And the people in the room, there was this kind of, that's just the most horrible 2 words to hear together. But there were also people listening online, and I couldn't see the comments, but apparently they were things like, nobody deserves a book contract. If you're going to write bigotry, then you don't deserve to get published. And we went to this guy on the call, and he ranted about how trans women are women, and they're not doing this to get into your bathroom, and nobody deserves a book contract, and I wouldn't have published you, and I wouldn't platform you, and I wouldn't use my media platform if I were tortoise to allow a bigot like you to speak, and so on and so forth. And afterwards I thought, I said they're sterilizing children, and you said trans women are women. These are not even remotely connected unless you do a fair amount of analytic work behind the scenes. So what's happening there? What's happening there is what's called a thought-terminating cliche. This man understands that something has been said that can't be fitted into his worldview, and he understands that if he changes his worldview, bad things are going to happen to him, very bad things. He's going to maybe lose all his friends. He's going to have to admit that he was wrong about a lot of stuff. And so instead of doing any of that, he stops his train of thought from going anywhere dangerous by saying the thing that is, in the phrase of the man, Robert J. Lifton, who created the expression thought-terminating cliche, a simple, reductive phrase, a simple, reductive, plausible-sounding phrase that is the start and end of any analysis. So we have to get past that. I mean, I couldn't get anywhere with him. He was in his righteous rage, but there were other people listening. And I tried to answer, but I think I would answer that differently now that I've had a night to think about it. And if somebody does that to me again, I think I would just point out, I would say, I said they're sterilizing children, you said trans women are women. There is only, there are maybe 2 things that you can say that are not morally bankrupt in response to they're sterilizing children. One is, I don't believe you, I think you're a liar, but I'm afraid you might not be, so I've got to find out more. And the other one is, oh, holy shit, tell me more. That's it. They're the 2 acceptable things to say. So I think I would say that to someone. I would say, you have failed. You have failed a moral test. The only acceptable things to say were those, and you said this. We've got to try and find the people who aren't going to do the thought-terminating cliches and talk to them. And then, those people over here, I don't know what it'll take to get through to them, but, I'm getting, okay, I'm going to get locked out.
I'll go next.
I was thinking that you might pick up the subject of the experience of young people, and I'd love to know more about the online world and how it creeps into young people's minds and your story.
I feel like I've told my story so many times, people are getting bored. Oh, thank you. Well, yeah, I mean, I was a trans man for several years, or that's what I called myself. And it was the internet that played a massive role in that happening. It's when I hated being a woman, I was attracted to other women, I was gender non-conforming, and rather just accepting that's, hating being a woman when you're young and all the stuff you go through is perfectly normal. Nothing wrong with being gender non-conforming, nothing wrong with being attracted to other women, but evidently I thought I was born in the wrong body, which was reinforced when I sought help at a gender clinic. So yeah, I mean, running through it, I went on cross-sex hormones, as you can hear in my voice. I underwent the double mastectomy and things like that. And when I started to feel regret for that and detransition, I decided I want to go and find other detransitioners. And I found a lot of them from various different countries. And their stories were remarkably similar to mine. Most of them were LGB, or gender non-conforming, or both. Most of them had other mental health issues that they were dealing with. So I thought, I'm going to talk about this, because this is actually really bad. And no one wanted to hear it, and people said, you're a liar, you were never really trans, there's like 2 detransitioned people, and they detransitioned because of transphobia. And I thought, okay, I'll just keep speaking. And then something happened this year, 2021, where I was sent 2 studies on detransition, one by Ellie Vandenbush and one by Lisa Lippman. And I was reading it, and it was like reading my own story, you know. The majority of the people, the 237 detransitioners that responded to Ellie Vandenbush, said the reason they detransitioned was because they realized their gender dysphoria was related to other issues. And among those reasons were that they detransitioned because they accepted they were just gay, they were just LGB, and they didn't need to believe that they were born in the wrong body for that. The majority of the people who, thank you. The majority of the people that responded to the Lisa Lippman study said they detransitioned because they came to realize that they could be comfortable in their natal sex, and 23% reported that the reason why they transitioned in the first place was because they couldn't accept that they were LGB. So this is an LGB issue, which is why I'm so thankful that I was invited here to talk about this today, because it really is a big problem. And then there was other things like 45% of the people who responded to Ellie Vandenbush said that they felt that they had not been properly informed about the health implications of transition before being handed cross-sex hormones and surgery. Over half, 55% of the people that responded to Lisa Lippman said that they would describe their evaluation as inadequate. So the evaluation process is poor, and I can tell you why, because I went through it myself. It's because of affirmation only. You can walk into these clinics and say, I've been horrifically depressed and suicidal for several years now, but it's because I was born in the wrong body, and they'll go, okay, cross-sex hormones and surgery. More than half of the people who responded to the Ellie Vandenbush thing said that they had at least 3 diagnosed comorbid disorders at the time of evaluation, with the most prevalent being depressive disorders, anxiety disorders, such as PTSD. Why wasn't that addressed before they were allowed to transition? 38% of the people who responded to the Lisa Lippman one said that the reason why they detransitioned was because they realized their gender dysphoria had been caused by trauma, abuse, or other mental health issues. Why isn't this being addressed? Why are LGB people... And you know, I'm throwing statistics at you so you can get a good idea of what's going on, but I've actually lived it. You know, being an LGB person who went through medical transition because I couldn't accept myself, and when the mental health professionals who were supposed to help me and all the other detransitioners, rather than sitting us down and saying, you know, there's nothing wrong with you, you weren't born wrong. Instead, myself and the many other detransitioners that I've spoken to, many of whom are younger than me, by the way, and are LGB, need to live like this for the rest of our lives. You can't undo cross-sex hormones. You can't undo surgery. And I'm fucking angry. Excuse my language. So, yeah, the reason why I came here today is because I know that you're all just as angry as I am. And I know that the abuse is awful. I know that a lot of you have probably received worse abuse than I ever have. But if we can stand together and speak out for this, for LGB people, for vulnerable people struggling with mental health issues, for people who, they need to know that they weren't born wrong. And I'd thank you in joining me in saying that.
You always do that. Every time I hear you speak, there's always a standing ovation. You always steal the show. It's fantastic. Thank you so much, Sinead. It is weird. I mean, I can't help but say it's so weird that, 10 years ago, everyone was talking about homophobia and everyone accepted there was homophobia. Suddenly, now it's as if all these clinics and teachers and institutions and employers, they disappeared their homophobia. It just went underground and came out in new forms. The way your, therapists didn't even bother to ask any questions. On that subject, Tanya, I'm going to keep saying your name. Could you tell us about the work of Safe Schools Alliance and the work that you do against homophobia in schools?
Right. Hello. I'm not a public speaker. I occasionally ad-lib on radio and TV, but I've been told that I had to write a proper speech for this and tell you all about us and what drives us and clear up a few misconceptions. So we're all driven by the well-being of children. That's what drives us. Their physical, mental and emotional health. We want to keep children safe. That's far more important to us than what some journalists want from us, and it's definitely more important to us than what critics say about us. So some of the libelous things that have been said about us is we're accused of being anti-RSE. That's relationships and sex education. We're very pro-relationship and sex education. We think it's a really important part of safeguarding children. Children have a right to be told biologically accurate information. They have a right to know about how their bodies work. They have a right to accurate terminology. They have a right to know what the laws are in this country and what their rights are. It is true that we have campaigned against some RSE materials. We've campaigned against them because they weren't keeping children safe. Some of the things we've had withdrawn are programmes that described extreme porn acts to children as liberating. They've used awful slogans such as love has no age, and suggested to teenage girls that anal sex was a good way to avoid pregnancy, except they described this as bum sex in their literature. We're accused of being religious and right-wing fundamentalists. For the record, I'm an atheist. I'm a floating voter. I'm really not very engaged politically at all. I'm just interested in safeguarding. So I've no hidden agenda. I just want to protect children. I really took on board all my safeguarding training over the years, and I live by the mantras I was taught, which are safeguarding is the responsibility of every single adult in society. Everybody has a responsibility to speak up, to protect children and others more vulnerable than themselves. And the other mantra I live by is that you never know anyone well enough to say that they couldn't, wouldn't, or that didn't. That includes your friends, family. I used to be told once a week at work, that includes your colleagues sat here around this table. Nobody is above suspicion. You always prioritise the welfare of children. We're accused of being homophobic and transphobic and not wanting inclusion in schools. We're a group of parents, grandparents, governors, teachers, and many other health and educational professionals. Many of the group are lesbian, gay, or bisexual themselves, or if they aren't, they have lesbian, gay, bisexual, or trans-identified children and family members. A lot of our supporters are lesbian, gay, and bisexual, and we're really grateful for that. At one point, I noticed a sudden influx of gay men followers on the Twitter account, and I was, ooh, do they want to be friends, or are they waiting to call me homophobic? And they didn't speak for a while, and then they started tweeting. I was like, oh, that they're our friends, this is really good, they like what we're doing. So we have campaigned to have some trans inclusion toolkits and LGBT resources withdrawn, because one of our major concerns about these resources is they're actually endangering the very children that they're claiming to protect, and the very children they claim that this will benefit, they're the ones that they're endangering the most. They're removing these very vulnerable children from normal safeguarding practice of parents and schools working together. They're suggesting to young people that being same-sex attracted may mean that you're born in the wrong body. I mean, we've just heard from Sinead about the stuff she read online that made her think this. Schools should be challenging what children read online, not reinforcing it. We've campaigned to have some allegedly LGBT resources removed from school. They've been hideously inappropriate. They've introduced concepts such as chemsex, pony play, BDSM and leather fetish to 11-year-olds. And there's even been a link for where they can get their free fisting gloves from should they need them. And for this, we get called homophobic. I think it's homophobic to suggest that all gay people are in favour of this and that gay people don't... and that gay people don't care about the safety of children. That is homophobia. I mean, we see schools tweeting out stuff like lesbian is a non-man attracted to other non-men. A gay man is a non-woman attracted to other non-women. They're tweeting this homophobic stuff out and they're really proud of it. Something has gone horribly wrong. At Safe Schools, we think what has gone wrong is a failure of people to understand or implement both their safeguarding training and safer recruitment. Ofsted defines safeguarding as protecting children from maltreatment, preventing impairment of children's health or development, ensuring that children are growing up in circumstances consistent with the provision of safe and effective care, and taking action to enable all children to have the best outcomes. So that is what we're trying to do at Safe Schools. Safer recruitment is about ensuring that only suitable individuals work with children. And we believe not only should only suitable individuals work with children, only suitable individuals should write resources and policy that affect children. One of the premises of safer recruitment is that it is far easier to prevent a predator from entering your organisation in the first place than it is to remove them once they are there. This means thorough background checks, obtaining up-to-date references and exploring people's motivations for working with children. Sadly, not all people who want to work with children have good motivations, and that's really difficult to understand because most people have good motivations to work with children, and you judge people by your own standards, but really you do have to, unpleasant as it is, we all need to be aware that some people's motivations are not good. Organisations must operate a culture of vigilance where concerns are taken seriously. If there are cries of racist, homophobe, transphobe and pearl clutcher, we all need to remember that these are recognised silencing techniques and they must be ignored. The welfare of children is always paramount. Although we have only been campaigning for, well, as Safe Schools Alliance, we've been campaigning for two and a half years now. We're all volunteers, but we've managed to get quite a lot of high quality media coverage and a lot of whistleblowers approach us, as do desperately worried parents and teaching staff. Some journalists approach us and ask us for access to the families that we have represented in cases, and we always tell them no. That's what we're for. We're the voice to the media so that children and their families can keep their anonymity. We're not going to sacrifice the safety of one child for others. We care about all children, and that is our bottom line. We advise journalists not to ask us a second time, and if they do repeatedly ask us for access to families, we will not work with them again. We've identified a lot of safeguarding problems with RSE and PSHE materials. PSHE is personal, social, health and economic education. They misrepresent the law, they undermine the rights of girls, and they're incredibly damaging to the children they claim to help. Some of them are persuading children to collude with them and to keep parents in the dark. Why? What sort of person wants to do this? Some of them are seeking to remove children from established safeguarding frameworks. Again, why? What sort of person wants to do that? And bizarrely, many are homophobic and encourage transing away the gay and taking experimental drugs. Again, why? So what we want to know is why and how is this happening and how are we going to stop it? And what are you all here going to do to help us? So thank you so much for having me here, and it's really good to see so many people who care about children. It's so encouraging, so thank you.
Brilliant, well done. We're going to have an experiment here. We're going to do our first slides. They're bound to go wrong. Kate Grimes.
Thank you. Today I want to talk about homophobia in the NHS. It's a new homophobia that's worse than the old homophobia because now it's publicly celebrated throughout and across the whole NHS. I had a nearly 30-year career in the NHS. I started as a porter in my local hospital, and I finished with 10 years as a hospital chief executive. I'm kind of embarrassed about that now, listening to Sinead. I started in the late 80s, and I came out almost straight away, in part to avoid having to listen to homophobic jokes made in front of me. In the early 90s, I ran one of the country's largest services for people with HIV and AIDS. Almost all our patients were gay men, and homophobia in the broader hospital was rife. Some staff, they wouldn't treat our patients. A senior board member wouldn't let us take part in an open day the hospital was running because he didn't want people to know we treated those kind of patients. But things gradually got better for LGB staff and patients in the NHS until recently. Now, it's worse than it's ever been. They fly flags from the buildings in support of an ideology that says we are genital fetishists. Flags carried by people like this to insult and abuse us on university campuses, on the streets, at Pride. They pay money for badges and for training that says men can be lesbians, that gay men should have sexual relationships with women if they identify as men. You see doctors proudly sporting badges that threaten us. You see operating department practitioners in scrubs tweeting insults to us from their workplace, calling us transphobes and celebrating the hounding of a gay man from Pride. And talking of Pride, the NHS recently devoted a whole week to Pride. Now, I previously would have been absolutely delighted at this. I used to love Pride, but Pride is no longer a safe place for people like you and me. We get spat at, we get beaten, we get hounded. And recently in Paris, they tried to set some lesbians on fire. And so you can imagine my trepidation in looking at this Pride Week for the NHS, but I thought I'd give them the benefit of the doubt, and I looked at the programme. Well, it began with an hour from Nancy Kelly, Chief Executive of an organisation that has unilaterally redefined homosexuality to include heterosexuals, and who accuses us of being like anti-Semites. So not a great start. So then I thought, right, I'll look for the word lesbian in this week-long programme. Guess how many times the word lesbian appeared? Zero, absolutely right. What about gay men? I mean, surely there'd be a gay man in there. No, I'm not a gay man either. They did mention bisexuals, but non-binary was mentioned 8 times, trans people 9 times, and of course there was the obligatory queer. So no erasure of gay men and lesbians there then. So I wondered how this makes LGB staff feel working in the NHS. Well, quite a lot have approached me since I wrote that article I talked about earlier, and I asked them what it felt like to work in the NHS, and here's some quotes. Here's some quotes from LGB people working in the NHS at the moment. As you can see, they feel frightened. They feel distressed. Sorry, I'm feeling emotional here. They feel lacking in hope. And it's the NHS that's done this. It's not individuals. Frankly, we're used to individuals. This is the whole NHS. The machinery of the NHS, its senior managers, its HR departments, its regulators, all promoting a homophobic ideology. And it's crept into the language and the policies and the way we look at data. For example, recently I saw that we identify as lesbian and gay. Well, I don't know about you, but I don't identify as a lesbian. I am one. Thank you. They use the word queer, even though if it's shouted at us in the street, it's a hate crime. And just a couple of weeks ago, an NHS-funded organisation used the slur TERF. And they don't collect data on sex anymore, which is actually a real clinical problem, particularly for people that are transgendered. It's also a problem for medical research going forward. It confounds all of that research. Take, for example, people with HIV. We can no longer track its prevalence amongst gay men or its impact on gay men. And finally, I wanted to spend a little bit of time on the scandalous way people who are same-sex attracted are treated in the NHS. Starting with LGB youth, which we've already talked about a little bit. So the majority of people with children with gender non-conforming behaviour will grow up to be lesbian, gay or bisexual. A 2012 study of the children referred to the Gender Identity Development Service at the Tavistock found that 8.5% of the girls were heterosexual. Only 8.5%, and under 20% of the boys. So almost all of them will grow up to LGB. And their treatment is far from appropriate. So as a hospital chief executive, your most important job is to keep your patients safe, to make sure they get high quality, harm-free care. There's nothing that's more important in terms of that role. And we have a number of mechanisms that help us do that. So we make sure we have informed consent. We use evidence-based care. We follow our patients up to make sure there are no long-term harms. If we use experimental drugs or treatment, we make sure it's done within a proper, well-designed research trial. We listen to our staff. We create a culture in which our staff can speak up. Things go badly wrong when we don't listen to our staff. We create safeguarding mechanisms. We listen to our safeguarding leads. We listen to our whistleblowers. Absolutely every single one of those mechanisms has been thrown out of the window when it comes to our LGB youth. Every single one. If I'd have missed even a couple of those, I would not have expected to keep my job, and nor should I. But it's not just the Tavistock. This is a page from a leaflet that was designed by an organisation run from a London teaching hospital and part funded by the NHS. What it does is it encourages trans men to sexually assault gay men. Yeah, really. It encourages vulnerable young women who identify as men to go to gay saunas and engage in sexual activities with gay men while hiding their female genitals. No thought for the gay man that's been sexually assaulted, and no word of warning to the trans man that they might be committing a criminal act. You'd never see this in any other part of the NHS. So why is the NHS promoting such a homophobic ideology? Why is it treating LGB patients so differently? I think it's hard not to conclude that it's not homophobia. institutional homophobia. A few years ago, I might have said they're just being kind, they're trying to be inclusive, but so many people have stood up and spoken out, and they've refused to listen. And this is something that I'm determined to do something about. So if you work in the NHS or you think you can help, please stop me at some point today, and together we can make a difference. Thank you.
Hello, yes. One of the reasons they have to stop you is because you're going to help us write a report about the NHS, aren't you? So if you work in the NHS in particular, feed all your comments to Kate. And in fact, at the end of this session, well, actually, probably a few hours after the session, we're going to compile 3 different manifestos have been created. One has been authored by David Bell, the expert from the Tavistock. It's a sort of manifesto for what he thinks needs to happen within the treatment of gender identity. It's a 5-point, bullet point plan, which I think is really great. Kate is providing a sort of mini manifesto for the NHS, and our friends at Safe Schools Alliance has done the same for schools, and we will release that later on, and then you can retweet it to your heart's content. Now, Rona, I can see you staring at me, so that means, how long have we got? Well, remember, we want to try and get like 15 minutes of conversation with the audience, so that's to say you have to time yourself almost exactly to 7.5 minutes. There's your mic there.
Okay, so I got as far as I got to the Portman Clinic to be a forensic psychotherapy SPR. Then they let me have carte blanche to do what I wanted. So I set up this service, and I also did some time in GIDS as a troublemaker. I'm all for subversion and not fitting in and being a bit out there. And my concern is that this is all about conforming. And I've said this a million times, but growing up as in probably the only brown family in a very small town in North Wales, I remember going to school when I was 8, or however old you are when you go to school. And I came home and I said, "Mummy, I don't think I should be brown. I think I should be white like everyone else." And the task then for my mother wasn't to say, "Oh yes, you're born in the wrong body. You're trans-ethnic. We're going to give you ethnic cleansing, and we're going to bleach your skin and make you like the white person that you identify as." The task for her and for me was to expand my repertoire of what it was to be brown or non-brown and forge my own identity. And then if you think about my childhood, my parents had a pretty sort of detached, laid-back attitude to parenting, and I liked my action men. I also had a rather large collection of dolls, and I used to turn up at wait for my sister to finish her school to walk me home, and I'd sit at the back of her classroom with a little hat bag that I'd open and put out all my 29 dolls and play with them, and then as an adolescent I was a goth, and I probably had more eyeliner and lipstick than most women would, with any sort of sense of decency, would wear. And if you look at any photos of me as a teenager, I probably look like a transvestite. And I remember when I got on holiday when I was 20 to Turkey, and I was being sort of pursued down the streets by people who actually thought I was a transvestite prostitute. So, if I'd have had different parents, 30 years on, I might have been dragged down to the Tavistock Clinic rather than being a consultant psychiatrist working there. So that's my concern. So when I started my interest in gender dysphoria psychotherapy, I came there with a presumption of something, and then I presumed I knew what it was, but I didn't. And the more I worked in the field, the more I realised I didn't know, and I was learning. And the most useful thing for me was the luxury of having my patients who I had over a 12-year period, and a lot of them I saw every week for those 12 years. And I saw them in depth, and I knew them inside out, and I learnt a huge amount from them. And none of my patients who've ever seen me in a clinical capacity as their psychotherapist have ever considered me transphobic. I'm glad to be able to be at a conference here, because the last conference in the UK that they tried to invite me to speak had to get shut down because there was a 5,000 person protest outside, promised to be outside, so they shut it down for safety. And at that time, if you Googled me, I think one comment said I was the most evil, dangerous psychiatrist in the world, something. And most evil, dangerous, homophobic psychiatrist in the world. And the 13th page of Google was in foreign languages. I thought, you've got there if the 13th page is in foreign languages. Did a clean-up operation. It's all gone now, apart from there's one bit, one bit of dirt you can't get rid of. There's one bit that I quite liked, actually. It's Natasha Kennedy, and it's a video of. It actually looks like a Little Britain sketch. It's a video of 6 people sitting around with a PowerPoint presentation critiquing one of my papers. They don't know how to critique a paper, for a start. And I'm not quite sure, but it is like a comedy sketch, so I don't mind the fact that it's still there. It's worth watching. My population sample was skewed. It was it wasn't a gender clinic. It was a clinic for people who wanted to see a psychotherapist to help them understand and think about gender. So it's a very skewed population. But of those people, there were differing sorts. And I suppose the problem now is that we call everything trans, and it's a bit reductivist. And if you look at my patient population, 20% were what you would have previously called true transsexual. I'll come back to that. 5% were autogynephiles, which everyone knows what that is now, but for those of you who don't, it's men who get sexually turned on by the idea of having vagina or breasts. And 26% of my patients were post-operative regretters. And at that time, they were a silent population. No one knew they existed because no one followed them up. And they either said, well, we've been back and they said there's nothing we can do about it, or they said, we spent ages convincing our GPs, our psychiatrists, and the gender clinic to give us what we wanted. There's no way we're going back now and saying it was a mistake. So they're sort of living in silence, either in their new role or their other role. And have you noticed how nobody talks about transvestites anymore? Because they're all trans, and then they're all considered to be the same thing. When I was in working in GIDS, I thought there was something quite mad, and I realised that there was something what we called the transsexogenic. Something that I called the transsexogenic parent, and this is a parent who's armed with so little knowledge based on a half-an-hour Channel 4 documentary or a leaflet or something. And we used to get these children who are 3, 4, or 5, and the parents would come in and say, Johnny's told us that he wants to be a girl. So, we've told all the neighbours, we've told his friends, we've changed his name, we've told the school, they've done an announcement, we've bought him a wig, and I'm there cringing, and they're saying, oh, that's good. They're wondering how to get mermaids involved, and I'm thinking, this is bonkers. I was thinking of me with my little 29 little dolls and playing, and I thought this is really, really quite odd. And I remember saying to the person who was running the service at the time, I'm not sure what technical language I used, but it was basically saying, isn't there something quite mad about this? I meant mad in a sort of a clinical way in terms of sort of psychotic, delusional sort of. And the response he gave was, is it any more mad than being homosexual? And this is an institution which is rife with institutional homophobia. So, around that time, the Tavistock had never knowingly employed any homosexual person as a psychotherapist. They'd never. And they even said to an SPR at one point, in 2006, even though you're the only person that meets the person spec for this job, you know we couldn't shortlist you for the consultant job because we couldn't be seen to appoint a homosexual. That was 2006. So this is from an institution which is institutionally homophobic. I remember I did 2 terms when I was training, 2 terms on the pathology of homosexuality in my training. So this is from a context where homosexuality is this sort of pathological thing where something's gone wrong. So for kids, it's not surprising that rather than saying, well, your child's probably going to grow up to be a bit flamboyant or a bit sort of out there, but probably going to be a gay man, and it seemed sensible to sort of make them more conforming. And I thought this was completely bonkers. So I would just cause a fuss every week and have a big row. And then they were quite glad after 2 years when I sort of left them and I concentrated on my adult population. And what I found is that with my adults, the population that were called true transsexuals in the past, those are the ones with a fixed sort of very binary black and white thinking. When I did a sort of survey of all my patients over the 12 years, 100% of them would have been somewhere on the autistic spectrum. And if we think about autism, it's very black and white. It's very sort of yes, no, black and white, male, female, right, wrong. And if you ask them what it is about being a man or a woman, they just come up with stereotypes. They couldn't possibly think of being subversive or thinking outside of the box. So for them, it was a lack of being able to be subversive. And what I used to try and help my patients do is become more subversive. I would say gender doesn't exist. It's like gender's like religion. It's a man-made social construct that you can invest in as much or as little as you want, but you don't need it if it's causing a problem. But don't change your body, because, like I said, no one's bodies are wrong. Your relationship to it is the problem. And then so with And it seemed mad that it was people were unhappy or confused about something, but no one was helping them with the unhappiness or confusion. We were just focusing on their genitals, which seemed extremely bizarre. And there's two. I think there's a friend of mine. I think he's in the audience actually. There's two ideas that I stole from him that I'm going to quote. So I'm giving him credit now. I won't say who he is. But one thing he described was how we were talking about subculture and how. In the past, up until the advent of social media, subculture was based in music, and so I was a post-punk goth, and with a lot of makeup, and I had a back-combed Mohican, and I started medical school with a purple Mohican, and it was actually pink because I dyed it with 40-volt peroxide for 4 hours. Sorry, sorry. Anyway. My father maybe dyed it purple. So, where was I going with that? Oh yes. So subcultures, music-based subcultures. So they were all about being subversive and sort of rebelling, and that was normal. It's a normal part of adolescent development is to be subversive, and So I remember when Jenny turned up to school with massive back-combed hair, we were going, "Oh, you're so cool. What are you?" And she said, "I'm a goth." And within a week, we were all goth. There was an epidemic of goths in North Wales, and then social media came on, and then you don't really get youth subcultures based on music. But the nearest thing we have to subculture is being rapid onset gender dysphoria. So you get all these kids and teenagers who have no prior any problem with their gender whatsoever. Then someone at school says, "I'm non-binary," and then all of a sudden they come home and say, "Oh, Mum, I'm non-binary too." And basically, like I keep saying, non-binary is goth Mark 5. Just to bore you, Goth Mark 1 was post-punk, that was me. Goth Mark 2 was slightly softened, it was like The Cure. Goth Mark 3 was sort of like floaty, ethereal stuff and shoegazing. Goth Mark 4 was being an emo, and Goth Mark 5 is being non-binary and rapid onset gender dysphoria. And luckily for me, there was no such thing as a goth identity clinic as a child, because I'd be sitting here with tattooed eyebrows and tattooed purple lips, and although thankfully I might have hair, I miss that. But what we're doing is, rather than going like my parents did and going, okay, you look a bit strange, but fine, you're doing medicine, we don't care. We go, oh, you've got a medical condition, and we're medicalising being a goth, basically. Rather than just letting them get on with it, we're turning it into a medical condition, which is quite frankly ridiculous. And I teach medical students now, and I say to them, what would you do if a patient came in and said that they thought they were a woman and they're actually a man? And what would you ask them? And they say, oh, we'd ask them, are you sure, and for how long? I said, really? I said, what would you do if your little brother came in and said that he thought he was a girl? Would you ask that? They go, I'd say, what you'd really ask is, what on earth are you talking about? And they said, oh, we can't say that. I was going, why can't you? That's what you're thinking. Oh, we're not allowed to say that. We're not allowed to think like that. And then I make it even more ridiculous. So I point to this sort of young white male, and I say, what if you said to me that you believed you're an elderly female Eskimo or black Nigerian, would you be, or would you be delusional, or would you be? And he'd say, no, if I identified as one, I would be one. And I'm thinking, oh my God. I'm thinking, you're meant to be scientists. You're meant to be medical. You're trained to be medical practitioners. Oh no, but if I identified, you want to shake them, shake some sense to them. Because I remember doing medicine. It was all about being scientific and evidence-based. I've got to shut up, haven't I? Okay, all right then. So the other thing that the quote that I'm going to borrow from my friend, who I think is in the audience, if he is, was he said about the children in gender clinics. He said, at last the heterosexuals are able to castrate their gay children like they've always wanted to do. As in, chop off their balls, which is true, So, and I see parents who are saying, oh, we're really wanting to basically castrate our child, and it's just very strange. Anyway, I better shut up.
Hello. That's fantastic. You hear me? Yes. Before we start throwing the mics around the audience, I was going to do a very fast, quick answer round where I thought it might be helpful if you could remember any lines or any means by which you peak transed or got people out of the gender identity trap. Any conversations you've had with people, things that you said that made them go, oh, now I get it. Is that a really difficult one? I'll go back to you since I curtailed you, but you're not allowed to talk about wigs or makeup.
I think I pique anyone because I don't shut up about it. I think most people I know that that's all. It's actually all I know about. And
no secrets to how to turn people round.
It's like a sort of an island of awareness of knowledge in an abyss of nothing, knowing nothing about anything else. So I bleat on about it constantly at parties, dinner parties, any opportunity, bus stops.
Good. That's number one. If you're looking for any advice for how to turn people round, just keep bleating on about it.
So if they haven't peaked, then they'll know I'll carry on.
Good.
So
Great. Helen, any clues?
I don't think you can change somebody else's mind. The only person who can change their mind is themselves. So you have to plant seeds, and the best way to do that without the wall coming down and the person just saying trans women are women is to make open-ended statements or to ask questions. So it's to say things like, I'm a bit worried about that thing that I heard, I'm a bit worried about this thing I heard in my children's school. Like, I'm just a bit worried that something's gone wrong here. Or did you see that thing where there was that person who'd been a bloke who was doing weightlifting in the Olympics? I'm a bit confused. And get them to start talking, because then you have a chance of a conversation starting as opposed to just a thought-terminating cliche.
Good idea. Bleat on, ask questions. Sinead?
Whenever someone says, oh, you piqued me or you helped pique me, it tends to be because they're like, basically, I never knew they would let someone who was as mental as you transition, you know? It's like, because you're told that there's such a rigorous sort of evidence-based, clinically neutral process in being able to decide whether you're going to hand someone very powerful cross-sex hormones and things like that. So when they hear that, you know, I kind of bumbled my way up to the clinic, and there was a year waiting period during which time there was no counselling or therapy. And so between me being evaluated at the clinic and being handed the cross-sex hormones, not even 6 months had passed. And they're being told, oh, it's rigorous, it's years long, and I'm like, nope. And they're like, oh, well, you must have been very mentally healthy. And I'm like, well, my first evaluation was mere months after I was released from a psychiatric ward after a breakdown. You know, so I think people, if you just go by the lovely unicorny mainstream media, you think that it's a really clinically neutral, professional, rigorous process. So when they hear from people like me, and that it's actually the complete opposite of that, they're like, okay, maybe it isn't the sunshine and rainbows that we're being told it is.
Yes, brilliant.
I actually think I've got any tips. I find that I start talking and then people get a certain look on their face like, you cannot be talking the truth. And at that point I stop because I know that they've switched off. And even my sons, they're constantly re-getting that look on their face when I say something. It doesn't stick. I'm going to try the questions. I think that's a really good idea.
Great. My thing that I've started doing with friends who think I'm a complete lunatic, I've started sending them links to Instagram to the FTM sites that celebrate double mastectomies. And I don't say anything, and I just say, look at the age of these girls who've had double mastectomy, and look at the things, and look at the fact that there's a site that celebrates the fact that young girls have cut their breasts off. And I find that's one of the things where you just leave it with them, and I don't think anybody really thinks that's healthy.
Yes, I like to ask awkward questions because I don't think you can't change people's minds. People have to get there on their own, but you can ask awkward questions. And I like to ask my children's schools and colleges and politicians, what happens when you have two children who have the same gender identity sharing a room overnight? So they're the same gender identity, so they can share a room, but they're different biological sexes. If an underage pregnancy occurs in that situation, who is liable here?
Brilliant. Who has a question? Just put your hand up, and one of our two very experienced mic holders will come and... Oh, I like when there's a baroness in the house.
A really boring question, but it would be intensely helpful to people like me up the road, over the road. How did Parliament get left out of this whole overtaking by the NHS of self-identification, which nobody agreed, which the minister said wasn't to happen, which Parliament had already discarded and wasn't doing it? How did we get bypassed? What did we do wrong?
Wow, there's a good one. Helen, how did Parliament get over all this? What has been happening? How is this lie, this fib, this notion of gender identity, why do people get captured by it? It's not just bullying. It seems like is it because it's such an elegant idea, or is it just...
It is an appealing idea, and it falls in a sort of a progress arc narrative of sort of half a century or longer, in fact, of, you know, another marginalised group brought in from the cold. So when you've been trained on this narrative, along comes what looks like the next one, and if you're not paying attention, and most of us aren't paying attention, we're doing other things, this just seems like the next thing that good people do. And so I think that was about 80% of it. And I'm sorry to say, Baroness Emma, I think the other 20% is sheer cowardice, including from our elected representatives. It's understandable because people have to get re-elected, and there's a well-known phenomenon in political economy, which is that you can have a very tiny but organized minority who care more about one thing than anything else, and then a much, huge majority who care about lots of things. And the tiny minority is the one that can often get its policy through. That's how subsidies happen, for example. Like, they're bad for most people, but they're good for a tiny organized clique. And so people in Parliament, they're thinking, I'm not going to get re-elected. Somebody else will speak up. Someone else will speak up. Like, I know, because I've talked to people in the lobby, that most politicians are very worried about what's happening. They really are. They know that this is all a bit mad. They are worried about kids. They understand why we have single-sex spaces, etc., etc. But there are absolute terrifying lunatics who make it clear that they will get you deselected and unelected if you stand up, if you're the first person to stand up. So people were cowards.
I'll just add a couple of words to that, and because I think that's mirrored in the NHS itself, in that I think that, although I would probably put a greater proportion on the cowardice, I'm afraid, but I think it's a small minority of activated individuals who have captured people because they've jumped on the bandwagon of the LGB, and we're now in a position where many people in the NHS don't like to speak up and say things that might be controversial because there's enough pressure on them, particularly managers, enough pressure on them as it is, to hit targets and so on, and to challenge the people at the top is very difficult. And so you wouldn't do it unless you were really personally invested, like maybe someone like me. I might do it, but then I was always spoke up more than I should anyway.
I was so glad you do. I won't go everybody. We want to get as many questions as possible.
I'm a very old and long retired psychiatrist, but I do, because I've been involved for years with the Right to Die movement, I do a few reports for people who want to go to Switzerland for an assisted suicide. I recently saw a trans man who had been told that life would be wonderful after surgery and finds that it isn't. What shocked me about this was when I asked him, what sort of follow-up did you get? He said, well, the surgeons followed me up. The psychiatrist didn't. He didn't have a single post-operative consultation with the psychiatrist. And while the surgeon said, we have to tell you what could go wrong with the surgery, the psychiatrist never said what might go wrong with the transition. And I'd just like to add that I'm not at all surprised that this is happening at the Tavistock, which, apart from being, as Naz says, still totally homophobic, it was based on the doctrines of a man, Freud, who said in 1916 about, we have the truth. I am as convinced of it now as I was 10 years ago, and that when he was sniffing cocaine as if it was going out of fashion.
Thank you.
I'm going to... Is this working? Yes. Yes, it goes. Whilst we get the next question, very quickly, do you think that the whole approach to gender dysphoria and gender identity is going to become one of the great scandals of psychiatry? And with what context and in what time frame? Quickly.
Just to respond, just to stick up for Freud, because I'm not anti-analysis, and Freud was very clear that he didn't have the complete exact everything, and it was meant to be a model to revise. And if you look at the rest of medicine 100 years ago when Freud was around, it was all very different as well. So true analysis is about constant revision and refining. It's when people get stuck like a religious doctrine that this is the way, that and it's usually people who aren't very good at psychotherapy or newly trained, or they've just about got the hang of it and they can't revise and think outside the box. But the better people are usually better at it. But in terms of a tsunami, which I predict, absolutely, if I saw so many regretters 20 years ago, 10 years ago, and that was when GIDS was a tiny little collection of people borrowing a room in the Portman Clinic, seeing a handful of patients. Now it's a whole floor of the Tavistock with sort of thousands-fold increase. So, of course, and my patients, and yes, I asked a gender identity clinic why you don't follow them up, and they said because we think of them like caterpillars becoming butterflies who are now free to So give them what they want, and they'll be happy. Apparently, tsunami. I don't know how big, huge, about 10 years.
I think we've got one more question. I think we've got... Oh, there's... Great.
First of all, thank you to all of you. You're amazing. Thank you for all you're doing. I'm Paula Diana. I'm a mother, I'm a woman, I'm a feminist, and I'm shocked for what is happening. My question is, do you think it's the time to start lobbying to make puberty blockers illegal for children?
Who would like to tackle that one? I would be naturally you, but I think maybe, why don't we go with Sinead? Sinead, how many of your contacts and friends who are in the detransition world strayed into puberty blockers?
Well, I couldn't give you a number because I've never counted, but you know, the ones who did go on puberty blockers inevitably have had that horrible realization that a good number of them are now sterile. So any hopes of them ever having children is done. I don't know if you know, but when you take puberty blockers, well, I mean, it's not just a pause, it stops your development physically and psychologically. So you could be someone who is, say, 20 years old. If you were put on puberty blockers when you were 13 and you were male, for example, you have a 13-year-old boy's penis on a 20-year-old body. So it is completely experimental. I do think they should be legal across the board, absolutely, because it's not a pause. You know, it has these long-lasting effects. And when you go to the NHS and you say, what exactly do puberty blockers do? And they'll say, we think it affects bone density and we think it affects the brain. It's like, you think? Then why are you giving it to children?
So it was a bit obvious when I started to look into those a couple of years ago that if you stop somebody from going through puberty, that you are not only going to make somebody who's sterile, but you're going to make someone who is sexually functionless, because we gain our sexual function during puberty. But when I said that, people would say, you know, where's the evidence? What are you talking about? And so on. Anyone who's read Abigail Schreier's recent, really mind-blowing interview with two gender doctors, two of the people who have, you know, sterilized and so on children, will have learned a new expression, which is orgasmically naive. If somebody is orgasmically naive when they start on puberty blockers and then they go on cross-sex hormones, they will remain orgasmically naive. I think you might try piquing your gay male friends with this one.
Any more? No, I think we'll be finished. I think we've been drawn to a close. Thank you so much for all the contributions. I'd like to leave you with one final thought. I do remember 40 years ago, as I used to walk along the Clyde, one of my inspirations, if you're looking for a quote, was there's a wonderful statue on the Clyde of La Passionara. I was a communist when I was 18. I'm not a communist now. But the motto, La Passionara's great motto was, better to die on your feet than live forever on your knees. And I think all of these people here and all of you people out there are living that motto.
Well done. Okay, so that was only session one. Dear God, can we take much more? I realised I didn't introduce myself at the beginning. Everybody else got introduced and I didn't. So, hello, I'm Rona. I'm a lesbian. I never do dick. Okay. So my main job today, as I said, is to keep this thing running in time, mostly because the Palladium want the jacket back for a production of Aladdin. So if you could move out to get your coffee and then come back in when we shout on you. Thank you.